The blizzard roared like a wild beast, howling against the thin wooden walls of the small cabin deep in the forest. Inside, Ethan Hayes, a battle-scarred retired firefighter, sat motionless before the fireplace, the flickering flames reflecting in his sunken eyes. Outside, the temperature had dropped to a deadly low, the icy wind slicing through the night as if nature itself was punishing anyone who dared to survive until morning. Ethan wasn't afraid, he was used to solitude, to the eerie silence that came with isolation in this cabin. But that night, he did something he never expected. He noticed a sound that had no right to exist in the middle of the deadly storm. A scratching at the door, weak, desperate, like the claws of a lost soul scraping against the wood. Ethan frowned, setting his coffee cup down with a firm clink, the steam still curling upward. He tilted his head, listening intently. The sound came again, this time accompanied by a muffled, trembling whimper that cut through the howling wind. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear but from an unsettling instinct. Something was pleading for help, and it had found its way to the one man who had sworn never to turn his back on those in need. Ethan stood, moving slowly toward the frost-covered glass door, each step weighted with hesitation. Through the ice-coated pane he saw it, a silent figure standing still amidst the raging blizzard. A German shepherd, its fur dusted with snow, trembled before the door, its glowing amber eyes locked onto his in a silent plea. But what made Ethan's breath hitch wasn't the mother dog, it was the two tiny shapes, nearly buried in the snow beside her. Two fragile puppies, so weak he could see the faint rise and fall of their breathing in the freezing air. "Jesus," Ethan murmured, his breath fogging up the glass. His hand hovered over the door handle before stopping. Open the door? His mind raced with questions, doubts swirling like the storm outside. This could be a trap. Who knew what lurked in the darkness beyond? Or maybe he simply didn't want to get involved. He had left behind a life of rescuing others to find peace, not to turn his cabin into a shelter for lost souls. But the mother dog's eyes, deep, desperate, cutting into him, made it impossible to walk away. The wind let out a final shriek as Ethan twisted the handle. The door swung open and the freezing air knifed through the room, carrying with it the scent of ice and fragile survival. The German shepherd didn't move at first, still standing in the snow, her legs trembling as if afraid that the next step would be her last mistake. The two puppies pressed close against her, one so weak it could no longer stand, collapsing into the snow. Ethan knelt, his voice hoarse against the wind. "Come on, don't die out there." The mother dog let out a soft whimper, glancing at her pups before carefully stepping forward. She gently took the weakest one in her jaws, carrying it over the threshold, the second pup stumbling after her. As Ethan slammed the door shut, the storm's roar was muffled, leaving only the heavy breathing of the three creatures who had barely escaped death. Grabbing an old blanket from the couch, Ethan wrapped them up, feeling the violent shivers racking the mother dog's body as warmth began to seep into her frozen fur. He crouched beside them, watching as the mother curled protectively around her tiny pups, her amber eyes still locked onto him, not with gratitude but with the wary distrust of someone who had been betrayed before. "What the hell happened to you out there?" he muttered, not expecting an answer. But deep down Ethan knew, he hadn't just opened the door for a stray dog and her pups. He had let in a mystery, a painful story he wasn't ready to face. That night, as the firelight flickered, he wondered whether he had saved them, or if they would be the ones to save him. The dim light of dawn filtered through the frost-covered cabin window, casting a pale glow on the wooden floor where Ethan sat, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. By the fireplace, the German shepherd, whom he had named Grace, lay curled up, her two tiny pups, Snow and Ash, nestled against her belly. Their faint, whimpering cries came in waves, each one cutting into Ethan like a blade. Grace lifted her head, her golden eyes still wary, but now tinged with exhaustion. She had survived the storm, but at a terrible cost. Her body was gaunt, her fur matted with ice and dried blood, signs of a struggle Ethan could only imagine. "Damn, Grace, you're a warrior," Ethan muttered, standing on unsteady legs. He rummaged through his kitchen, finally finding an old can of chicken soup, the closest thing to food he could offer a creature on the brink of starvation. As he placed the warm bowl near Grace, she let out a low growl, her teeth flashing in the firelight. Ethan froze, heart pounding. "Easy. I'm not your enemy," he said, voice hoarse, raising his hands in surrender. After a tense moment, Grace dipped her head, lapping at the soup, but her eyes never left him, a silent warning that she was ready to tear apart anyone who came too close to Snow and Ash. The next few hours passed in quiet tension. Ethan kept his distance, watching as Grace slowly relaxed, her breathing steadying as the fire's warmth seeped into her frozen body. But then a weak, wheezing sound from Snow made Ethan jump to his feet. The smallest pup was convulsing, its tiny legs twitching in the air. "No, no, no!" Ethan shouted, rushing forward, only to stop dead as Grace snarled, leaping between him and her pups. His pulse thundered, sweat beading on his skin despite the cold room. "I'm trying to help," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Grace stared at him, suspicion burning in her eyes, but then slowly she lowered herself, revealing Snow, who lay gasping for breath. Ethan wasted no time. He grabbed a warm cloth, gently wrapping the tiny pup, rubbing it to stimulate its frail body until its breathing steadied. Grace watched, unmoving, her gaze like a knife at his throat. A single mistake and he would pay for it. Making a decision, Ethan reached for his phone and dialed the nearest veterinary clinic. "This is Ethan Hayes," he said, his voice shaking. "I have a mother dog and 2 puppies here. They're barely hanging on. Can you help?" A woman's voice on the other end was cold, almost detached. "Bring them in now, but I can't make any promises. They might not make it." Ethan hung up, the weight of her words crushing him. He looked at Grace, now licking Ash gently, and swore under his breath. "I won't let you lose them." The drive to the clinic was a battle against time and nature. The roads were slick with ice, Ethan's truck skidding dangerously around each bend. In the back seat, Grace huddled close, Snow and Ash wrapped in a worn blanket. At one point, the tires lost traction, sending the truck spinning, and Ethan heard Grace whimper in panic. "Hold on, we're almost there," he growled, forcing the vehicle forward through the blinding white haze. When they finally arrived, the vet, a stern-looking woman named Dr. Larson, took one look at Grace and shook her head. "She's severely malnourished," she said, running a hand over Grace's frail frame. "Surviving last night was a miracle. But these 2, she gestured towards Snow and Ash, now trembling in a technician's hands. "They're weak. I don't know if they'll pull through." Ethan clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. "Do something," he all but begged. Dr. Larson sighed, then gave orders for an 4-drip for Grace and formula feeding for the pups. Ethan stood outside the exam room, watching through the glass as Grace lay still on the table, an 4-needle in her leg. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, Dr. Larson emerged, her expression softer than before. "She'll make it," she said. "She's stronger than I thought. As for the pups, they have a chance, but they need constant care." Back at the cabin, Grace's eyes held a spark of life. She let Ethan sit closer now, even refraining from growling when he reached out to touch Ash, who wiggled weakly in his hands. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Ethan watched Grace curl protectively around her pups, their breathing steadier than before. But then, in the dead of night, a sound echoed from beyond the door, not the wind but the heavy crunch of footsteps on the snow. Grace shot up, ears perked, a low growl rumbling from deep in her throat. Ethan's fingers tightened around the knife handle on the table, his heart hammering. "Someone's out there," he whispered, glancing at Grace, who now stood like a living barrier before the door. Their journey to healing had only just begun. But the shadows of Grace's past had found them. And Ethan knew, the real fight was only beginning. The darkness cloaked the cabin like a thick, suffocating veil, the only light flickering from the fireplace, casting restless shadows across Ethan's tense face. He sat motionless in his chair, gripping an old hunting rifle, his eyes locked on the window where Grace stood, fur bristling, growling ceaselessly. The heavy, deliberate footsteps outside had vanished into silence, but the air inside remained dense, charged with the weight of an impending storm. Snow and Ash huddled close to each other near the fire, their soft whimpers like needles piercing Ethan's heart. Grace turned to look at him, her golden eyes burning with a fear he had never seen before. Not fear for herself but for the tiny lives she had fought to protect. "What is it, Grace?" Ethan whispered, rising slowly, the gun cold in his hands. He pulled back the curtain slightly, his pulse hammering as he peered into the night. "Nothing, only snow and the silent trees." But then, a sharp crack echoed from the tree line, like a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. Grace lunged at the door, claws raking against the wood, her snarl a declaration of war. Ethan flinched, nearly dropping his rifle. "Easy, Grace," he barked, but deep down he knew, something was out there and it wasn't by chance. The night stretched on in suffocating anticipation. Ethan didn't sleep, his eyes burning from exhaustion but refusing to close, his finger resting near the trigger. Grace lay rigid by the door, ears erect, every muscle coiled, ready to strike. When the first light of dawn crept across the snow outside, Ethan almost believed the nightmare had passed. But then Grace snapped upright, fur bristling like a wild wolf, and a figure emerged, no longer lurking but standing boldly on the porch, less than 10 steps from the door. Ethan cracked the door open, icy wind rushing in, carrying the scent of damp earth and danger. A tall, broad-shouldered man, maybe in his 40s, stood there in a tattered coat, his face obscured by a filthy hood. In his hand was an old, frayed rope, the loose end dangling like a silent threat. "That's my dog," the man said, his voice low and cold, his eyes glinting with something cruel. "I've come to take her back." Ethan felt his blood boil, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Yours?" he growled, stepping onto the porch, the barrel aimed straight at the man's chest. "She showed up here half dead, carrying 2 pups you haven't even mentioned. If she belonged to you, why did she look like she crawled out of hell?" The man smirked, his crooked teeth yellowed and rotting. "She ran off. Happens sometimes. But I raised her. She's mine by right. Right?" The word ignited something in Ethan. He remembered Grace trembling in the snow, remembered Snow's faint cries on the brink of death, remembered the desperation in her eyes when she found him. "You don't have any rights here," he snarled, stepping closer, the gun's muzzle nearly pressing against the man's filthy coat. "She's not your property anymore. Get the hell off my land. No. Or I swear I will shoot." The man hesitated, stepping back slightly, but his gaze remained sharp. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man," he sneered, though his voice wavered. "That dog is trouble. You'll regret this." And then Grace lunged. She burst through the doorway, teeth bared in a feral snarl, a sound so raw and furious that the man paled. The rope fell from his hand, forgotten in the snow. And for a moment Ethan saw it. Grace knew this man. She remembered. The unseen scars on her body, the hunger, the cold, the pain he had inflicted. "Grace back!" Ethan shouted, but she didn't move, her paws sinking into the snow, her gaze locked on the man like a death sentence. The man cursed under his breath, stumbling backward before turning and bolting into the trees, his shadow swallowed by the mist. Ethan stood there, breathless, lowering the rifle with trembling hands. He knelt beside Grace, resting a hand on her head. "He's gone," he murmured, voice tight with emotion. "You did good, girl." Grace turned to him, flashing her teeth one last time as if to say, "I'm not a victim anymore. I am a protector." Snow and Ash scurried out, yipping excitedly, oblivious to the danger they had just escaped. That night, as the fire crackled once more, Ethan sat with Grace and the pups beside him. He knew the man might come back, with a rope, with weapons, or with others. But he also knew Grace would never run again. She had found a home, a family, and the strength to face the past. Ethan ran his fingers through her fur, whispering, "He'll never touch you or the pups again. I swear." Grace leaned into his hand, completely at ease for the first time, her golden eyes shining with unshakable trust. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but within the cabin, a new family had been forged in fire and ice, unbreakable, unyielding, and ready to fight for each other. Ethan looked at Grace, then at Snow and Ash sleeping soundly, and he knew, they weren't just survivors. They were warriors. And no matter how many times the darkness returned, they would stand together.